We're looking at the book of Ruth, and we really need Ruth after Judges. The book of Judges ends on a very sad note, and we've seen that God's people are just as wicked as the very nations that God sent them into the promised land to judge. And so we're looking at Israel and wondering, is there any hope? At the beginning of Ruth, we might wonder, because Ruth starts with a family who seems to be experiencing God's curse. They've left the promised land because of famine, and they have suffered. In fact, pretty much the whole family dies except for the mother, Naomi. And she is now a widow and having to return home with absolutely nothing except for her daughter-in-law, a Moabitess, who actually demonstrates great faith. And it's in this Moabitess that we start to hope that perhaps God isn't done with his people. The chapter began with a family leaving because of a famine and ends with Naomi and Ruth coming back at the time of harvest. And in chapter 2, this glimmer of hope shines even brighter as Ruth meets Boaz. The chapter begins how Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. He's obviously a relative of Naomi's husband. 3 times he's referred to as a kinsman redeemer. Chapter 2, verse 20, chapter 3, verse 9 and 12. And for those who are familiar with Israelite laws and customs, this is like ding, ding, ding. There is some hope for these 2 women here. The key phrase, of course, here is a worthy man. It basically describes a man of substance, I think primarily referring to Boaz's character. And we'll learn later why Boaz was so worthy, but for now we should stand impressed by Ruth. She doesn't slow down at all on this return to Bethlehem, but even though she is the foreigner, she immediately asks Naomi's permission to go and help them find food to eat. And we might be tempted to ask, why doesn't Naomi go with her? And that's a good question, because while Naomi was older than Ruth, she probably wasn't much older than 45 or 50. And yet notice that Ruth doesn't ask it. She's content to serve Naomi without grumbling. Again, that's loving kindness. Ruth doesn't really seem to have a plan beyond going out and gleaning among the ears of grain, but God is at work behind the scenes, bringing her to exactly the right field, that of Boaz. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field among the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. It's interesting how the author puts this in such an understated way, isn't it? It's literally her chance. She chanced upon. One author translates this in modern language. As luck would have it, she chanced to come to the part of the field. But we'll see later, this is not simply a lucky decision at all. God is even in control of seemingly random decisions. And it's important to understand that God is writing a story throughout all the specific events of history. He's the master storyteller, and he knows exactly where the story he's writing is supposed to end up and how to get it there, even when the circumstances of our lives seem so disconnected and even random. Notice how the writer helps us to feel the joyous surprise of God's providential concern for his people in the beginning of verse 4. Ruth happened to go to a certain part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. It's not just that Ruth was working at Boaz's field at this particular time, but also that Boaz happened to come to his field at the exact time she was working on it. Thinking back to how the book of Judges ended, what happened to the young woman who visited Bethlehem in Judges 19? It's terrible, wasn't it? What do you learn about the men of the town from this chapter? They are wicked, these men. What does that tell you about Ruth's situation as she goes out to work in the field? It's dangerous. And so look at the way Boaz shows kindness. First, he notices her. Second, he places her. Whose young woman is this? Check out how the people respond. They say basically she has no one. She's a foreigner. Boaz then goes to Ruth and gives her instructions. Glean in my field. Stay close to my young women. He takes action and commands the young men not to touch her. And then he actually makes sure the young men serve her by providing water for her. This is incredible kindness. Boaz is a demonstration of what God wants a man to be. How God is going to deliver Naomi in the end, his people. It's through the godliness of Boaz. In response to his kindness, Ruth asks a key question. Why are you helping me since I am a foreigner? And there are a couple reasons this is such a great question. The first, of course, is just the fact that we're all foreigners to Israel. And as we read through the Old Testament, we're constantly wondering what hope is there for people who are foreigners. Second, this is a helpful question because we're going to see what a godly man respects. And then third, part of the purpose of the book of Ruth is to show how David can be king when he has Moabite blood running through his veins. And so this question and Boaz's response is intended to point us toward an answer. Boaz answers by saying that he's heard all about her. Her act of love for her mother-in-law was so stunning that it caused the entire community to sit up and take notice. Boaz continues to show his character by, in a sense, praying that the God of Israel would reward Ruth for her actions. And we're seeing here that God is not opposed to someone simply because of their nationality, but is willing to rescue and reward all those who come in faith in order to find refuge in him. Ruth responds to Boaz by thanking him for his grace, specifically for the way he's encouraged her and spoken kindly to her, even though he did not need to. And we see in Ruth's speech her humility. She says, I found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I'm not one of your servants. Think about how a change in Ruth's humble attitude could have completely changed her perspective. What if she had been proud? She probably would have been upset with Naomi for not coming with her. And then she would have been irritated with God for putting her in such a dangerous position. And as a result, she would have found it difficult to even really be thankful to Boaz for the way he was serving her. After this, the person telling the story quickly moves forward to mealtime. For us, meals aren't such a big deal, but meals were more than meals in these days. They were times of fellowship and expressions of hospitality and demonstrations of friendship. Because of this, everyone must have been surprised when Boaz invited this foreigner to eat with them. And Ruth must have been keeping her distance because Boaz has to say to her basically, come close. Then Boaz tells her to eat some of the bread that had been prepared for himself and his workers, and he won't let her eat it dry either. They must have had a certain way of bringing flavor to the bread, which is why he's telling her to take part in this with them when he says, dip your morsel in the wine. Next, amazingly, Boaz serves her. He passed to her the roasted grain, and this expression could be translated to give with the hand. And then finally, he made sure she was able to eat until she was full, even with some of the food left over. Boaz continues to show his loving, godly concern for Ruth in verse 15 and 16. After she had gotten up to go back to work, he exhorts his workers to allow her to continue to glean among the sheaves. And what is more, they must pull out some bundles and leave it for her to glean. He wants to make sure she gets enough. Then he makes sure they treat her respectfully by commanding them not to reproach her and not to rebuke her. You can imagine what it must have been like for a foreign woman to be working in a field with a bunch of men. Boaz is not only concerned about Ruth's physical protection, but also her honor. We can also imagine that some of the workers may have been tempted to become jealous of Ruth. Who was she to receive such attention from Boaz? And yet Boaz will have none of it. He looks for ways to make sure that Ruth is taken care of and perhaps even drawn into the existing community. In the next several verses, we see the result of Ruth's labors and Boaz's generosity and Naomi's reaction to it. Ruth works hard and she finishes the day with about 22 liters of barley. And that's just an amazing haul. Some say this was the equivalent of a half month's wages in just one day. She takes home what she's gleaned, and of course Naomi is shocked. Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. You can see how surprised and amaze Naomi as she doesn't even pause to let Ruth answer her questions. And Ruth, too, is excited. The person telling the story tries to slow us down at this point, perhaps to feel the excitement with her, by basically repeating the same thing twice. She told her mother-in-law with whom she worked and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Ruth doesn't know the significance of this, but Naomi clearly did. She offers a second blessing in verse 20 and then explains why this was such a wonderful occurrence. Naomi sees what happened as a demonstration of God's loving kindness because Boaz was one of their redeemers. And this concept of redeemer is one of the more important ideas in the book. It's actually a legal term. It describes a relative who is responsible for the well-being of a member of his family who comes into distress. And so if they lost their property, Leviticus 25 tells us the Redeemer was to make sure that the property stayed in the family. If they somehow were sold into slavery to a foreigner, Leviticus chapter 25 also tells us the Redeemer had the responsibility to free them from that slavery. Numbers 5 tells us if they committed crimes, the Redeemer would help them make restitution for those crimes. In Job 19, Psalm 119, 154, especially, the Redeemer's job was to defend the cause of the person who had gotten themselves in trouble. And it wasn't technically part of their role, but it was definitely a possibility. Deuteronomy chapter 25, they could marry someone who had gotten in trouble, the wife of one of their relatives, if the relative had died, in order to continue the seed. And of course, we know in Israel how important the seed was. Why was the seed so important? Genesis 3:15, because it was through this seed, the promised seed, that the Messiah would come and God would reverse the curse. And so obviously Israel's very concerned about descendants and the seed. And so Boaz was this redeemer for Naomi's family. And so Naomi is joyful and she finally has some hope. And Ruth, whom the narrator now reminds us again was a Moabite, explains that Boaz was continuing to look out for her by telling her to work with the young men until the harvest was done. And Naomi was excited about that, but she adds a word of counsel. She says, "It's good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." And this shows finally Naomi's waking up and she's concerned for Ruth and Ruth's reputation. And it also reminds us just how wicked Israel was at this time. She's worried that Ruth might be assaulted. And Ruth models submission by doing exactly what Naomi had asked her to do, working in Boaz's field for another 6 or 7 weeks. And this chapter ends hopefully. Naomi now has food and Ruth has hope here. They have hope of this Redeemer. But really the crisis is not fully resolved as we don't hear any more about Boaz and Ruth's relationship. Instead, she goes back to work for another 2 months and nothing moves forward, or so it seems. We'll see in chapter 3 that there are a couple big obstacles to resolution, to Ruth and Naomi's situation being resolved, and really, ultimately, to Israel's situation being resolved. But that's for next time.